So just one thing. I'm not exactly sure what's happening tonight. Why the lines were so long, but since a lot of you guys seem to be coming on a regular basis, if you could do me a favor and next time actually show up at 5:45. I could trick you and tell you that the meeting is going to start way earlier than it actually does, but I'd rather you guys just come at 5:45 if that's possible, because now we have a great and I guess usual turnout, but took a little while. So, I guess I'm mic'd up.
Testing.
Are we?
Test.
I guess so.
Test. All right, wonderful. So first of all, thank you so much. I'm very excited to have you guys. This is pretty much, the dream panel for me of VCs in the space. Some of the brightest mind and some of the deepest pockets as well.
He's talking about you.
He's properly sitting in the middle.
So we're going to be covering a lot of different things. So as usual, for the people that come here regularly, I'm going to be asking a few questions. But by all means, this is not meant to be a conference. This is meant to be a community event. It's really about you guys getting a chance to ask questions to this gentleman. So we'll start circulating mics, sort of early after the first few questions. So there are several areas I'd like to cover. One of them is sort of the general state of the space, then why big data is an interesting space for you guys specifically. Then I'd like to go into more specific details about specific segments and area within big data. And the last area I'd like to cover is specifically funding. How does it work? What are you looking for? This type of thing. So starting with the sort of the state of the union. So I guess it's fair to say that there's been enormous excitement about big data over the last few years, but specifically over the last year. So this event is full. Strata is sold out. Even the Harvard Business Review now had like this gigantic cover page with big data, including an article that said that that being a data scientist was going to be the sexiest job of the 21st century. Which, by the way, is kind of funny when you think about it, because it was co-written by DJ Patel, who's a data scientist. So he essentially called himself sexy. But so I guess the question is, the hype is there, but where do you guys think we are in the cycle? And specifically from a VC angle, typically. Or a lot of VCs, at least in theory, want to be contrarian, right? So typically, when you start investing in an area and everybody talks about this area, and it's in just about every paper out there and blog, typically it's too late. So what do you guys think? Where are we in this cycle?
From my standpoint,
you're home, so you get to go first.
Home field advantage.
Home field advantage.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So when I started IA Ventures, it was on the belief that this wasn't a cyclical but a secular trend, and that this was not something that was going to subject itself to the fads of 2, 3, 4 years, but this is something that was going to ultimately be underpinning every business. And I think, having started talking about this at the beginning of 2009 and having been in the business in and around big data for the last 25 years, I think that that's been borne out. So I'm not really worried about where we are in this cycle. To me, the issue is much more our specific areas labeled as big data getting overheated, and I think that's just a function of herd mentality in venture investing. Certainly if I see one more social media monitoring dashboard, I'm going to puke. Having seen about 100, no joke. That said, there are huge opportunities in literally every segment, enterprise and consumer, of where we can either apply, new breakthroughs in big data infrastructure, kind of in the vertical value stack from kind of core compute, database, high performance computing, predictive analytics, data visualization, and then horizontally in platforms and applications that themselves leverage the creation of massive data sets where the end consumer experience gets better and better by virtue of there being more people and more data flowing across the platform. So I will say I'm probably seeing, I shouldn't say seeing, I'm seeing so much enterprise, but I would say I'm more apt these days to do consumer than enterprise, simply because of the contrarian bent. And we've seen some really, really interesting applications of big data in the consumer space. So that's kind of my state of big data.
Bing?
Yeah, so I think, I agree with Roger. I don't think this is a 1 or 2 year trend. I think this is a multi-year trend that has a lot of fertile areas of innovation. I actually think hype is good. Hype is what creates this audience and fills up the room of entrepreneurs trying to solve really hard problems. And I think one of the reasons why I think this is such a lasting fundamental change is a lot of the big data technologies and platforms are actually fundamentally very hard. So it's not going to be solved, in a year or 2 years, but I think it's going to be, we're multiple innings of iterations, of new ideas, of things not being quite right and retweaking and growing. So I think one of the exciting things about big data, at least from the Accel perspective, has been that we think there's going to be an ecosystem that gets built. This is not going to be 1 or 2 companies, but I think there's going to be, over time, dozens of companies that pick off different places, all the way from components to storage up to the applications and everything in between that can really change both consumer and enterprise behavior. And the one nice thing about big data that I've seen is whether the economy is good or bad, everyone wants to have answers to solve the problems, right? So I think big data is something that is going to be an interesting area of innovation regardless of where the macro conditions are, and the fundamentals are going to stay strong.
Yeah, so to Roger's point, I guess I'm a little embarrassed now about investing in the big data-driven shawarma vendor on my way in.
It's very contrarian, Matt. I like it.
I think the hype may have gotten to me. Kidding aside, I think my colleagues here have a very articulate view of this, and the net is just to hammer this home for the audience. This is a 20-year secular trend. I learned how to program in the mid-1970s. And
when you were 3.
No, I'm actually a lot older than I look. There goes the youth vote. So my dad is a historian. And in fact, he's a historian and a professor of law specializing in China. He was one of a handful of people called in by the Deng Xiaoping administration to restore some degree of rule of law in China. That's the household that I grew up with, or grew up in. And you get kind of a long-term historical perspective when people are sitting around your kitchen table having an argument about legal precedent that goes back 4,000 years to stuff scratched on bones. And I remember reading as a young man in the early 80s, during the first quasi-collapse of some of the dodgier PC vendors, the PC business is over. And then I remember reading a few years after that, the electronic game business is over. No one's ever going to play a game again. I was a member of a partnership that shall remain nameless that actively killed a portfolio company that was recently sold for $400 million on its patent value alone, because they'd come up with the original patents, working tech on LTE and related communications media. And the discussion in the partnership, to which I was privy, was a bunch of guys snarling about how 3G was a fraud and no one was ever going to need more than a megabit of bandwidth to their mobile device ever. So the skeptics about long-term secular trends have, if you'll pardon my coarseness, have been full of shit over and over and over again. The guys like Roger, who in his professional career have been good at identifying 20-year secular trends of one kind or another, have typically been the ones who are right and make the money. Big data is a 20-year secular trend. PCs, for all of the skepticism, were a 20-year secular trend. If you look at the Gartner, so-called Gartner hype cycle, what they're missing is an overlay on that boom and bust and then stagger to profitability curve that they like to show, and that's the somewhat jagged but generally up and to the right dotted line that represents real adoption of everything that's been accused of hype, whether it's cable TV or cable modems or cell phones or the frickin' steam engine. Long-term secular trends are, as Ping and Roger both pointed out, immune to recession, immune to macroeconomic variation, and immune to hype. So if you're here because you want to start a big data related company, as long as it's not a social media dashboard, I think you're betting well with your time and your family's money.
And Matt, I just
and hopefully our money too.
You used to sound like I was like Twitter or something. No more tweet decks, no more interfaces. Just one other thing I'd like to add on to what Matt said is, it's very difficult for large entities to simply rip and replace legacy technologies and to spool out that data and spool it up into something new. So that factor in and of itself is indicative of a many, many, many year trend, because it's going to take a generation for a lot of these companies to adapt. And of course, by the time they do that, we'll be on the next generation. But that's just the nature of enterprise solutions in general. So I think that is underpinning this kind of a successful growth that we'll see in the big data landscape.
Yeah. I was actually going to add one more thing. To Roger's point and to Ping's point, he doesn't say this, he just invests this way. So it's speak softly and carry a very successful investing stick. Intrinsic technology, stuff with intrinsic value. So Roger said he's investing in consumer stuff, but if you take the time to wander through Roger's portfolio or you wander through Ping's portfolio, it's really hard stuff. It's not things that are simply block and tackle engineering. It's novel algorithms. It's vast amounts of data. It's stunningly small processing windows. It's millions of simultaneous events per second. It's stuff that even if the companies hit a brick wall in one direction, I hate to use the dreaded word, they can pivot or at least have a 15-degree course correction. And because of the deep value of the tech, find some degree of success. And we cheerfully emulate Ping and Roger in that obsession with foundational technology. In a portfolio of roughly 60 companies, we've had 6 fail. Let's just call it what it is. Ran into the buzzsaw of a malevolent monopoly that denied them, data that they needed for analytics or processing. Couldn't penetrate accounts fast enough. Penetrated the wrong accounts. Wound up looking like something out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. And in 3 years, in very, very high risk investing, our worst case outcome was 95% return on capital. And in the failed companies, we got 2x, 3x cash on cash returns because there was value in the technology. It was good for us. It was good for the entrepreneurs. So I would just add, don't do easy stuff.
Great. So a little bit to the one of the points that both of you mentioned. What is your experience at, from your portfolio companies of where we are in the level of awareness on the customer side? So let's talk about enterprise adoption. Is there a lot of evangelization going on? And how do they sell? Is there a lot of discussions around ROI? And if so, how do you establish the ROI of a big data software solution?
I think the thing that I would say on that is enterprises are not new to data. So I think this whole big data thing is, sometimes people think it's some sort of new phenomenon that no one's ever thought about how to extract value from data and make smart business decisions. So I think enterprises understand about it. We're sitting at Bloomberg, right? You guys understand data, and healthcare companies and pharmaceutical companies, they all understand the value of data. I think what's changed is their ability to actually manipulate larger scale data, do more interesting things with the data they couldn't do before, right? So I think the value of data has gotten bigger. And I think that, for me, big data has nothing to do with the size. It's actually the value of the data people are extracting. It doesn't have to be large data sets. In fact, most of the Hadoop clusters you see in the enterprise are not that big. But they're doing things they couldn't do before because they're taking unstructured data and mixing it with other relational data and actually doing more fundamental analysis that they couldn't do before. So I think a lot of the enterprises get it. And one of the things I find particularly interesting is so many of the technologies that we talk about in these big data world is actually coming out of the internet data centers. whether through open source technologies or just architectures. And the enterprises are now going to these internet data centers and learning and extracting and embracing some of these technologies for the very first time. So I think one of the things I've always done is take a look at what's going on in the internet data centers as kind of a blueprint and an early indicator in terms of what are some of the technologies enterprise and some of the analysis that enterprise will end up doing down the road to drive their businesses. So I think it's already been happening. I think it's only going to accelerate as some of these technologies, whether it's Hadoop or these NoSQL databases everyone talks about, actually get to a point where of maturity where they can actually be more easily consumed by the enterprises.
Do you find, and you guys, Roger and Matt, should feel free to answer, but do you guys feel that there are certain industries which are more advanced in terms of their interest in big data solutions over others?
I'm going to chime in and say, I think Ping nailed it. If you run a Fortune 2000 business anywhere in the G7, G8, or even in an emerging first and a half world economy like Brazil or coastal China, you have to have near real-time KPI to stay alive. And I think people have this odd view of the enterprise as brontosaurus-like, maybe because we've all read too many Dilbert cartoons, but that's not the case. These are, by and large, very well-run companies that often do more difficult stuff in aggregate than a lot of our startups in deference to the Global 2000. And they are sophisticated consumers of data. What they are not is speedy to the point of foolhardiness. So we all fetishize, or we'd like to fetishize, the Stalinist posters at Facebook, ship fast and break things, or break things and then ship fixes later, or what the hell, just break stuff. And you can't do that if the wrong pipe spits out the wrong stuff and everybody in 18 surrounding villages dies, or if the wrong pipe spits out the wrong stuff and your product kills 2 million children under 6 because your medicine was toxic. So the enterprise has this weight of regulation and obligation surrounding it. If you understand that, and you also understand that they're very sophisticated about their performance metrics, that they are data-driven, you can sell them almost anything that will improve their outcomes as long as you're respectful of the fact that they have some pretty weighty requirements that they have to deal with.
I think both these guys hit on a number of very, very deep points that you should all internalize. The enterprise is fantastic to sell to if, number one, you understand that by its nature it's going to have a longer sales cycle. And you need to be capitalized and have a sales process and a follow-up process that respects that. The other is that, in general, the minimum viable product is higher selling to the enterprise for many of the reasons that Matt mentioned, which is a lot of times you just can't fuck it up, right? If you're talking about touching a regulated business, whether it's healthcare, banking, whatever, you just cannot afford, hey, it broke. I think what we've seen is that a number of the large enterprises have done a fantastic job in creating sandboxes, these safe areas to play and test, which previously did not exist. And I think even 3 years ago, it was much, much harder to sell to the enterprise because it had to be right. It had to be full production ready. It really couldn't be in beta because the stakes were so high. Now, I think a lot of companies have environments that are just much safer for running beta-type tests. So, in that way, I think the enterprise is very, very, very fertile ground, and they are willing to pay a lot of money for a product that is truly differentiated. You just need to understand the terms of engagement.
And actually, I was going to amplify on your point. Matt asked about verticals. I would say, paradoxically, the verticals where people die or vast amounts of money are lost if the right answer is not arrived at in increasingly smaller windows of time are in fact the most aggressive customers for some of these technologies. So banking, whatever you may, however many Matt Taibbi articles you may have read in Rolling Stone about banks, the fact is they're custodians of a lot of people and a lot of people's money. So they can't screw stuff up. They need better answers faster. Roger lived in this world for years. That's what made him a pioneer in this big data area. Healthcare. Accel has a really interesting footprint and an emerging interesting footprint in stuff that provides answers to major healthcare organizations, and that was prescient. I mean, it's kind of hearkening back to your successful healthcare practice that you guys had back in the 80s and 90s, although a lot less capital intensive. Manufacturing businesses where a tiny shift in the supply chain can put an entire company out of business, or where products are highly regulated and guessing wrong has terrible results. Those are big consumers. Oddly enough, folks in retail tend to be, I found, a little more smug because they were earlier adopters of some of these technologies and they think that they've gotten it mostly right. So they'll buy stuff, but it seems like it's a longer sales cycle. And there's also not as big a gun held to their head, whether it's internally or by a government agency.
The only thing I would add to everything Matt said, which I agree with, is it's such a great time to be a startup right now because the incumbents are so far behind. They have not innovated in the last decade. And any of the big data dimensions are the application storage, the data layers. So we're finding tremendous embracing of these startup technologies in the enterprise this cycle around than we did the last 10 years. They are finally fed up with kind of the vertical integration that all their incumbent vendors are providing them, and there's been no innovation coming out of them. So I think it's a real opportunity for startups to really think about the enterprise now in a very unique way.
So we're going to be talking about technology and application in some detail, but before we get into this, do you guys think that the opportunity is fundamentally just technology, or could it be also some form of content, like newer sources of data, rare forms of data? Could it be services as well? There are companies like Think Big or Analytics or Mu Sigma or to some extent Opera Solutions, which are essentially services driven. Any thoughts on technology versus services versus content? And in content, that would include data marketplaces.
Start with the consumer guy.
No, I think the easy search and customization and automation of content is something that's a very, very interesting area. I look at NewsCred as being a really interesting example of that, where you're talking about a curated set of 800 of the premium sources globally, and then the ability to parameterize a customized feed to get exactly the news you want in real time on an a la carte basis, paying only for what you want. And yes, I think that is simply the tip of the iceberg. Also, we see very, very valuable services business as part of core kind of big data technology companies, because a lot of times having these front deployed engineers are essential for helping the customers get the most value out of the tools, and at the same time that can be a profit center. Would I invest in a pure services business that did not have, even if it was around big data, but it didn't have this kind of core technology that Matt alluded to? No chance. But am I afraid of services augmenting awesome technology to help the customer get the most out of it? No.
And I think Roger's portfolio has a lot of this stuff, which I think is interesting. Is this open data movement, I think, is real. So historically, data was very locked down, very siloed, in very specific storage databases and applications. These days, that's no longer the case. Whether it's social data that's widely available, you just got to get the feed, or even SaaS applications, cloud applications, where the data actually is much easier to get to and integrate across different data sets. So I think that's one of the things that I've been seeing a lot of interesting innovation around. People are now no longer just looking at the data that their application generates, but how can you integrate that with a lot of applications outside of your own environment, and how you can drive more insights. So I think that's going to be an exploding trend as more and more people realize that exposing their data actually drives more value. In the past, it was like, how do I lock down my data and keep everyone away? In terms of services versus product companies, I think there's a lot of, in early categories, early markets like we are now, services-led selling is quite common for technology companies. I don't think that's something that is a stigma. You look at VMware in the early days, right? They had to do services in some cases. So I think that's just natural for any new platform. I think that's very different than the services business, right? Which is really around human resource intensive thing. And I think those businesses right now are doing well. The Mu Sigmas, we're investors there, and Opera, they're doing very well. I just think they're valued very differently over the time than a pure product technology company.
What about small data? You started alluding to this, Ping. And I guess by that I don't mean big data infrastructure tackling relatively small amounts of data, but companies like, I don't know, RJ Metrics, Custora, who are both presenters here in an earlier session, that actively target small and medium businesses with relatively small amount of data. Are we entering into an era where it's not just big data, but just about everything gets instrumentalized, and therefore there's value in any smart analytics business?
So that I think I'm only going to speak for myself and not for Ping or Roger, but I think that's a very slippery slope. I think that's like saying that very interesting, very successful companies like Intuit and would-be Intuits like Mint or this young company in the SMB accounting automation space in Dinero. Okay, they aggregate some data for small and medium businesses, and they do some analytics. Okay, well, unless, for me, they're generating deeply proprietary data that covers millions of small businesses, it's not interesting to me. I mean, we're investors in a company called Zen Payroll, and we're investors there because they demonstrated on a very small amount, really, of their own money, that they could gut ADP, that customers deserted ADP in droves to have essentially single-click, over-the-web payroll in all 50 states with this very well-engineered company. But to me, this isn't a small business service company. This is a company that is very cleverly giving away free payroll services for small companies, 5 and under, to produce the kind of analytics that Bloomberg would kill for on the economic direction down to sub-zip plus 4 of a huge section of the American economy. So that's interesting. But small data, not so interesting. That's just another software package. I mean, I might as well be investing in Peachtree Accounting or something like that. Now, that being said, Ping's earlier point about the value of the data as opposed to the size of the data is an incredibly important one. By way of another example, and I'm mentioning these because you wanted concrete stuff tonight.
Yes.
These are not advertisements. These are,
They just happen to be in your portfolio.
All means just pimp your portfolio.
They're companies I know enough about to.
That's neither here nor there, Ping. Come on, man.
These companies, whose very existence they owe to Mu Sigma's excellent support. There's and Ping and Roger and I have enough overlap that they shouldn't give me too much shit. So there's a company that we did called Moleculo. So Moleculo has figured out how to take the random soup that comes out of gene sequencing machines like Life Technologies or Pacific Biosciences or Illumina, and actually turn it into a deterministic, chromosomally faithful DNA map, to the point where on the fly they can say, in an alternate universe, Mr. Jobs, you have 2 of the 3 genes that lead to this form of pancreatic cancer. You inherited them from your mother, not your father, which means that you are much more at risk. And by the way, as of last week, those genes actually began expressing proteins associated with pancreatic cancer. And oh, by the way, those genes are located in this specific cubic millimeter of your pancreas. Now, they can do that on a couple 10 gigabytes of data, not terabytes, not petabytes. On 2 gigabytes of data, on a blood sample from a would-be mother and father, they can say deterministically that 1 in 10 million genetic disease that's the heartbreaking substance of nighttime news stories, for you it ain't 1 in 10 million. It's 1 in 3. So do you want to have a child or do you want to adopt? Or you can have a child, but by the way, you'll need this therapy either in utero or immediately when the child is born, with 100% accuracy on 3-4 gigabytes of data. So we love those guys, and we think they're, it's a rare example of doing well by doing good, and we hope they continue to knock it out of the park. But it's tiny amounts of data. But if you're a parent that's trying to have a kid, this is everything. Your whole world is in 4 gigabytes of data. So Ping's dead on, and he said this before in public, and we're cheerfully capitalizing on his insight.
Just to build on one of the points that you mentioned a proprietary data set. Where do you guys, why is fundamentally a big data investment interesting from your perspective? Is that because there is this crazy demand out there, or are there intrinsic aspects to a data business, whether that's economies of scale, network effects, what have you, that make it different and sustainable in a way that other businesses are not?
I think we believe that they create unique barriers to entry, and that whether it's the proprietary data asset, the unique data that's generated by that flowing across the platform and using machine learning and AI to improve the customer experience, or if it's solving a really, really, really hard technical problem that, and one other point on the enterprise, I'm seeing a lot of companies now that are specifically engineering solutions that don't require a rip and replace, that can run alongside legacy infrastructure until that infrastructure can then be replaced. But it's a smooth transition, not an abrupt one, which of course makes the bar to adoption exponentially higher. So for us, it really comes down to barriers to entry, whether it's pure technology barriers or it's kind of the data asset that's created through the creation of a really smart platform.
I think one of the other things, the observation I would make, it's rarely the data, it's actually the metadata that they generate on top, right? So everyone can collect the data, and that's become commonplace, but very few people actually know what to do with the data. So one of the things that I've seen a lot of companies that come through our door is they collect petabytes of data, but they don't do anything with it. And especially some of these mobile companies that we meet. The mobile device is probably the single best data capture device known to man. It's with you 24/7. It's got all kinds of sensors on it. And you see all these app companies, and they have this very simplistic user experience. And I'm like, what do you do with the data you collect? And they look at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, that's how you actually iterate the product experience, how you get stickier, how you can actually get engagement and monetization, all that kind of stuff. And so I always look at people that actually look at the data they're collecting and see if there's anything new they can do to take that product in a new direction or service. And very few people actually think about the data as much as I would hope for.
Yeah, we specifically focus on the kind of the data, we call it the data centricity of the founders. So just because a company generates some interesting data, if they don't have the DNA to know what to do with it, and they haven't necessarily architected the platform in such a way as to make best use of it, that is a huge barrier for us investing.
Yeah, I think Roger and Ping have analyzed this well. There are companies that create uniquely valuable emergent metadata. It's an emergent property of both the data that they have and how they process it, and the possession of that data becomes very valuable. So I mean, to go back to the company I mentioned, Moleculo, they retain the rights to the blinded genetic data of every human or animal or plant that they are solving a problem for. So they're building deterministic genetic libraries of huge volumes of plant and mammalian tissue. And people are already, paying them pretty sizable amounts of money just for what they have. To Ping's point, just the simple aggregation of data is anathema to us. That's not a big data company. A big data company is attractive because it can hit one of the two characteristics, ideally both, that Roger cited. It is technically defensible for the long term, ideally for us, ideally more in an enterprise than a consumer context, but it works in both. Because this stuff is so hard, huge amounts of data, short processing windows, rabid demands for signal accuracy when it does embrace an analytical purpose. Intel says 2 nines is fine 5 years ago. Now you run anything in Intel, they want 6 nines, or they'll find where you and your family live through the location function on your laptop chip and kill you. I'm kidding. So that kind of tech has long-term intrinsic value. Can be redirected, can be repurposed. That's not true of other enterprise applications. I mean, all three of us have seen stuff that has been very successful in the enterprise that amounts to a repurposing of a green screen mainframe app. There were companies in the 90s in the proto-CRM business that said, oh, enter a customer record? Okay, I committed a record to Oracle or Sybase. Okay, that customer's unhappy. Okay, change a field. There are no analytics. There's no value to that data. It was shelfware. So big data companies, by contrast, have that intrinsic tech and or the intrinsic value of emergent data attributes, as Ping cited. And as I said earlier, when you invest that way, even your failed companies somebody wants to buy. So, and as an entrepreneur, if you hit a brick wall and somebody says, "Holy crap! You meet the Roger test and you meet the Ping test. We'd like to pay you, enough money to actually buy a place inside Manhattan." That's a good outcome for an entrepreneur.
Okay, great. Let's talk about specific segments in some detail. So I want to talk about infrastructure and then analytics and then application. So let's start with infrastructure. Has Hadoop won the day? Is that the technology that's going to be central to the ecosystem going forward?
This is where I get to boast about Cloudera. You want me to talk about something outside my portfolio? Go ahead, man.
All right, so I think there's so Hadoop I think will be a definitive platform for a lot of big data workloads. Companies like Cloudera I think are really doing some interesting things around that to extend it across different analytic workloads and data warehousing, et cetera. So I think if you look at the areas around analytics and large-scale data processing, data management, I think Hadoop is going to be a de facto platform. Now, there's a lot of other new projects getting started. I think they're all going to be very interesting. But the thing I always say, good enough is the enemy of great sometimes. And Hadoop has got that kind of community and critical mass around it that I think it's going to be harder and harder for other things to compete with it. That being said, I think there's a lot of things that are not within the purview of Hadoop, right? I think there's a lot of transactional stuff. There's a lot of different other workloads and applications that require new data structures, new data platforms that Hadoop is not well optimized for. So, I always encourage folks, there's not one platform wins the game, but I think there are going to be, within every certain application vertical, some dominant database platforms, right? And I think, Hadoop is one for a large segment of workloads.
So what's missing around Hadoop? Where do you see the opportunity? Is that pre-processing? Is that the real-time aspect? Is that where do you see?
Yeah, I think you're seeing a lot of activity around streaming in real time right now. I think there is always that move to kind of go from batch to real time to streaming to transactional. So I think that will always be the case. And how much does the cloud eras of Hadoop versus how much new platforms emerge. I think that will always be there, and I don't think it's going to be a one-size-fits-all. But the thing I always caution people is, some of those areas are really interesting technologies, but there's really not that big of a market for it, right? So you can come up with some really cool tech and then find that, hey, okay, there's like 4 people in the world that really need to have, nanosecond processing, right? And yeah, you can build a business around that, but it may not be the scale business that you're looking for. So there's some problems that are interesting to solve, but may not yield interesting businesses, right? So I think that's the balance at the data layer.
No, I guess it's just the only thing I would add is, it's clearly not one size fits all. I mean, Hadoop is great for certain things, web scale storage, key value, that's great. But if you're doing, like on Wall Street, that wouldn't work. I mean, it would work for long-term, for archiving large amounts of data, but it wouldn't work for, web scale real-time analytics in milliseconds. It just doesn't work that way. Complex computations don't do well in the Hadoop environment. So, but Ping's right. I mean, Hadoop is freaking massive, and kind of the NoSQL movement is here to stay, and it's a super valuable part of virtually any architecture I can think of. But is it the answer for every layer of the stack? Certainly not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say vis-a-vis Hadoop, harkening back to my comment about growing up in a China-focused household, one of the brilliant things about China that I learned from my historian father was, very similarly to India, it absorbed would-be conquerors instead of the other way around. A vast horde of Mongols shows up with fire and sword and a whole set of cultural practices, and 50 years later they're all speaking High Plains Mandarin Chinese and eating with chopsticks. The enterprise and stuff like traditional ETL and SQL and certain other things, I feel have some of those aspects. So I see Hadoop as the incumbent with fire and sword coming in and disrupting things, which is great. By the way, old empires need to be shaken up. But if you look at the number of people building SQL something on Hadoop, I think it's indicative that the old order may absorb the new order to a significant extent, or there'll be some odd blending of the two. I mean, I got Roger and I are co-investors in an arbitrarily scalable in-memory SQL database that serves some of the needs that he cited for Wall Street. But I've also seen people trying to do pure in-memory Hadoop implementations with solving some very difficult technical problems associated with that. And I always say, so what's next now that you made Hadoop run really, really fast? And they always say, SQL. So I think Hadoop has won the contest to be the dominant rebel army out of many, but we'll see what happens in the next 20 years of this awesome secular trend with Hadoop and the old guard, and how they blend and how they merge.
And I think to your point earlier, Matt, there's different layers here, right? And I think sometimes when people talk about Hadoop, they want it to solve everything, and actually Hadoop doesn't. There is reasons why there's other things like Hive and Impala, is because there is a SQL world out there that is incredibly valuable and is not going away, is only getting bigger, right? So I think the goal of Hadoop isn't to overthrow things as much as to extend into greenfield applications you couldn't do before with the SQL products, right? So I think there's going to be different layers, and they're going to segment, and hopefully they'll all settle down over the next 20 years to figure out which is the right areas for technologies to exist.
And if you guys are lucky, each of these innovations will become so rigid and so balkanized with so much money spent on them that there'll be billion-dollar startups like Informatica just to connect all of these uncooperative silos.
Great. So a little bit to those points. What about databases? So there's the NoSQLs, the new SQLs. So there seems to be like one coming out sort of just about every week. What on earth does still need to be solved that existing databases do not solve?
Matt, why don't you take that?
How long do you want to spend here?
In 30 seconds.
You have to pick one.
Yeah.
Pick one.
I mean, do you see additional opportunities in there? Should an entrepreneur today consider actually setting up a database company?
No, because you'd be competing with 4 or 5 overlapping investments between the 3 of us. And to quote the awful movie Rocky IV, we must break you. Kidding aside, I think that there's enough money in current database innovation that some of the survivors will address the 5 to 7 outstanding problems. So one is scale. So Hadoop, despite some really awesome work by Cloudera and some other contributors to the core Apache branch, is still pretty brittle at scale. Unlike, ironically, something that seems harder, which is military or industrial grade supercomputing, which has now had 30 years of effort, some of it slightly flaky open source, but still 30 years of effort in automating and providing reliable results at scale. There aren't a lot of 20,000 machine Hadoop clusters that run without a lot of babying, even at pioneers like Yahoo. So the second is an odd quasi-reciprocal of scale, which is performance. So Hadoop is not that performant at 20,000 machines unless you want to do weird things like run it in memory or spend $1 billion on solid state disk. The third is, again, this kind of gauge coupled criteria to the first 2, which is administrative ease. So it's hard to run and keep up and derive results from a raw Hadoop cluster. It's even hard to do that from some of the analytical layers that are being built on top of it. The fourth is what I would describe as industrial grade, or I mean, there are a lot of words for this. Fault tolerance isn't really right. It means essentially lights out operation, which again is a weird reciprocal of administrative ease. But just because I can start something with one click, or I know very seamlessly when things have gone to hell, it doesn't mean that I wanted them to go to hell between my single click to start the job and when I lost my job for things going to hell. So flawless operation, which Roger can tell you is a fact of life in many major Wall Street institutions for their mission critical stuff, still eludes most Hadoop installations and the fancy stuff built on top of it. And the last, I would say, is a mixture of security and federation capability. Again, they're really reciprocals of each other. So big corporations need to share the stuff that they're churning away on in Hadoop with 150 members of their supply chain and 17 different government agencies that want, live inspection of their results, especially if they're under a consent order or something like that. So the flip side of that is security, which is when I hand somebody access to 100 gigabytes at the very heart of my petabyte of churning data, do I know who they are? Do I know when they accessed it, for how long, what they did with it, and God forbid, did it go anywhere else? These are all really hard problems, and each one of these kind of criteria or vectors or themes, there's a handful of billion-dollar startups yet to be built. So that's not to say, by the way, that Hadoop is entering an early senescence or these problems are creating insurmountable friction. It's more creating opportunities for all of you, and I guess by extension us.
Yeah, and I think at least from my perspective, I think solving the problems of Hadoop aren't as interesting to me as probably because we're investors in the space via Cloudera, but also knowing what is going to be built on top of the applications, I think is a much more wide open area right now. I think the world doesn't need another 10 companies trying to solve the problems of Hadoop. I think Hadoop will solve a lot of its problems, and I think it's just like if you look back at MySQL 20 years ago, everyone had the same complaints around that database, and over time it got good enough, and it seems to have solved a set of applications, not everything, and I think that will happen in the Hadoop ecosystem over time, given the amount of energy behind, the amount of commuters and all that kind of stuff, and the actual deployment that's actually going through right now. So, but I think the thing that's wide open is all the stuff on top. I mean, there's just not enough applications. It could be a business intelligence, it could be a CRM, it could be all the things that the relational database market created over the last 3 decades that I think are going to be rethought and rebuilt for new data-driven platforms. And I just don't see enough energy and entrepreneurs at that layer. And it's really hard stuff, and it really requires you to actually understand all the things that Roger and Matt have invested in and actually build some cool stuff. So I'd encourage entrepreneurs to really focus higher up the stack. It can be vertical, it can be horizontal apps. I don't think either can be very successful, but trying to solve the next database. I think there's room for that too, but I'd encourage folks to think more broadly.
Yeah, that was exactly going to be my next question. So I guess what's above this is analytics, and what's on top is applications. So quick thoughts maybe from Roger and Matt on analytics and applications. Seems to me that the analytics space is getting more crowded, day by day. At the same time, the application space looks wide open. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to this issue of kind of solving hard problems, and I think there's still huge room to run. I mean, we've backed several companies in this vein that sit on top and generate real-time actionable information at web scale, looking at complex joints in the data that have been embedded in companies large and small now that are absolutely essential for the operation of their business, which of course is the holy grail, is becoming something that you just can't rip out, gives you the pricing power. So
like
by the way, the answer
like
you guys
Bloomberg
gave
terminal?
What's that?
Like the Bloomberg terminal?
Man, all I know is I need a Negroni right now.
So I think Ping and Roger are offering a lot of wisdom. I mean, we invest at 3 layers of the big data secular trend. So the bottom for us is the stuff that you've heard me say some things about, which is infrastructure. It is stuff that solves the physical problem of big data. How do I store a petabyte? How do I categorize a petabyte, 10 petabytes, 100 petabytes of high volatility data into any kind of database? How do I federate it? How do I secure it? How do I transport a petabyte of data besides a 747 full of terabyte disk drives? I mean, there's some ugly questions there. The layer for that above us is analytics. It's the tools that deliver, as Roger kind of hinted at, ideally near real-time, actionable business signal or guidance on top of those churning volumes of tremendous amounts of data. And then the top layer for us is what my partner jokingly refers to as SIC code transformation. This is what Roger and Ping, to an extent, were talking about, which is very deep vertical market knowledge amplified by some of these novel analytical techniques, in turn resting on volumes and velocities of data that were heretofore unattainable. And so, Roger's done some great stuff in this area. We did a company called LendUp that does real-time, single-person lending and risk analysis, so that hardworking nurse on her way home from the Rockefeller Institute who gets a flat tire, in 6 or fewer screens and no typing on a low-grade Android phone can qualify for a $500 loan at 30 to 90% net APR instead of 400 to 900%. And by the way, these guys have lower risk than a lot of the payday loan vendors. That's an example of a big data-driven company up at the application layer that's going to transform stuff. This is, as Ping said, really hard to do. So the great entrepreneurs in this area, and you can go meet them at one of Roger's meetups, or one of the, Accel's been generous enough to sponsor a bunch of big data events as well. You can talk to these successful entrepreneurs. You'll find out that they're an odd mix of infrastructure gurus, people who understand modern analytics extremely well, and then they have this very deep vertical market knowledge rattling around in their heads at the same time. The guys who founded LendUp were one of the first 50 employees at Yahoo, then went on to be in the office of the CTO at Zynga, knew a tremendous amount about consumer interface design and gamification and security as well. And the other guy had run Grameen Bank's micro-lending analytics and then a $32 billion portfolio of low to mid-range consumer loans at Citibank. So it's hard to put this stuff together, but if this describes some of your friends, go give them seed funding. Beat us to the punch.
One thing that Matt mentioned that I think is really, really important is we're talking about some of these deep science problems and some of these really profound applications. But one thing you can't forget about is user experience and design. And it doesn't matter whether you're selling to the enterprise or you're developing a consumer app. The punchline is it's got to be beautiful, intuitive, easy to use, and engaging, which of course is really freaking hard. And those people, those great designers, are really hard to identify. So I would say to try and identify these people as part of your founding teams is oftentimes a really smart thing to do. And a lot of these people actually come out of verticals. So they have very, very core vertical expertise. And a lot of these kind of big data applications that we're talking about have different skins and different experiences based upon the vertical that they're being sold to, while the analytical core is the same.
And I would actually add one thing to that, which is New York is like the Saudi Arabia of design talent. Meaning, as Saudi Arabia is to oil, New York is to design talent. If I had a teleportation device so that badass New York designers from all of the verticals with all of the years of experience that Roger has mentioned, and I could just have them popping in and out of some of our Silicon Valley-centric companies, I would be ecstatic. And in fact, I would argue that the first venture firm that figures out a way to unite, fairly deep design talent in New York. These are not people coming out of Parsons that are good at playing with fabric. Some of these are computer scientists from NYU or Columbia that have deep aesthetic understanding. Some of them are people on Wall Street who dealt with the presentation of complex information for years. Some of them are from the New York-centric equivalents of IDEO and other design institutes. This is a tremendous resource. And I would actually say in some sectors of big data, to really amplify Roger's point, pretty good tech with unbelievably good design actually will probably beat great tech with so-so design, and will definitely beat great tech with crappy design.
No doubt.
Couple more questions because I want to open it to people here. Cloud versus on-premise, is that a relevant? Is everything moving to the cloud? You mentioned transfer of big data, Matt.
I was going to raise that point earlier. It's a huge issue, especially when you're talking about the enterprise, especially when you're talking about the three-letter agencies or financial firms, or even healthcare, where the data is so incredibly valuable. There are huge privacy and security issues around it. There are a lot of places that unless you can give them an appliance or you can load it on their servers inside their firewall, they're not going to buy it. They are not going to put their data in the cloud. I would say there is growing acceptance of that and comfort with security around that, but there is still a huge business for on-premise solutions, and depending on what you're designing, you may need that kind of fork in your development path.
I.e., don't code only to AWS APIs. I mean, Ping, what's interesting is I think I don't have your portfolio memorized, but I think you guys have a handful of pioneering SSO and other, functional transform companies and some other guys. There's stuff in your portfolio that's already addressing some of these
this
problems.
Cloud versus on-prem thing, my take, you just have to go where the data is. Like if the data is being generated on-premise, your solution and product has to really be an on-premise. But increasingly, a lot of applications are starting in the cloud. That's where the data is generated, and therefore, they actually prefer you to have a cloud offering that mirrors that, right? So I think that's, for me, I think, trying to force fit one or the other, I think is really hard. I do think the trend line is towards the cloud. If you look at where applications are getting launched these days and where the data resides, they're not going to pull that back into the four walls to do their data munging, right? They're going to keep in the cloud. So I mean, I think you just have to figure out what the target use case is and just be practical about it.
Yeah, I was just saying you guys have been very good at identifying that identity management and some of these security issues that make the cloud and on-prem appear to be fungible in a way that makes the enterprise comfortable is a kind of cool way of circumventing the cloud versus on-prem debate.
Yeah, and that's less around like centrifying stuff. It's more around the user as opposed to the data itself. But yeah, it allows them to get comfortable that wherever the data is, they actually have some control over it.
Last question from me, which is going to be deliberately fairly generic. Let's talk about funding and what you guys are looking for that is specific to big data that you would not be looking for in any other startup. Proprietary technology, specific team members, specific problem.
I mean, for us, there's got to be that data-centric DNA in the founder. That's kind of the ticket to play the game. The mere existence of large amounts of data is absolutely meaningless in our calculus. And then solving a really hard problem. That's again, it's all about barriers, and whether it is the creation of this super valuable data asset and the metadata that stems from that, or it's core tech. We do both. We're incredibly happy to fund either one. But in terms of team construction, I would say the only thing there's generally a rock star technologist that is one of the founders, but oftentimes there is a business co-founder. Sometimes there are two technical founders where one of them has more of a business bent and they really take more of the kind of front deployed customer interaction while the other one's focused on the back end until they scale up.
And an awesome designer.
And an awesome designer. When they're there at the beginning, it is a gorgeous thing. What we're finding, though, honestly, is a lot of really smart young coders actually have design experience. So they may not be the elite, but they can actually come up with some beautiful stuff that can live for a long time.
Ping?
Well, I mean, there's nothing about big data that is different than our requirements for other sectors, frankly. I mean, reality is, I think, for us, strength of entrepreneur and is probably the most important thing, and how they, and it's the team construction, but it's also if they understand the nuances of a particular category better than the other 20 other companies that we've seen. Because I will tell you, any good idea will have at least 20 other people with the same idea. So it's rarely the uniqueness of the idea, but it's actually the distinctiveness of the interpretation of that idea and the execution of it, I think, is really what distinguishes the entrepreneur. And that's kind of what we spend our time understanding. And then I think the category and the spaces, I think, are pretty well understood in terms of, the market opportunities.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Hey, so one thing that I kind of thought you guys were saying in a number of points is that there's a lot of opportunities where if you can sort of build tools that make solving some of these challenges or engineering obstacles that companies have a little bit more tractable, and address sort of having a good production integration deployment story, that is sort of a compelling meta pattern for creating a good business in that sort of space. Am I sort of correct in inferring that?
And sorry, can you just say your name and your...
Oh, Carter Schoenwald. I have a little operation called Well Posed.
Yeah, if you're referring to solving intrinsic economic problems of the enterprise, I don't know enough.
Well, I mean more on the engineering side of, like, everyone wants to do, say, sophisticated analytics or whatever, and, like, as an example, if you look at a lot of large organizations, it's the people, they have to basically have someone babysit the people doing the analytics to port it over to production, and as an example.
Right. So I would say there are actually two aspects to this. Three. One is a generic solution to problems common across many enterprises that touches on operational inefficiencies, where the realization or the transformation is big data driven. One is a vertical market specific analog of that. And then the third is kind of, to your point, a meta version of that, which is, hey, everybody does analytics, and today it takes, 12 PhDs and for all of the, hype around a variety of companies, people still end up coding a lot of stuff in C or Java or R or, God forbid, even SAS. Solving those data production problems, if, to Roger's earlier point, it is really hard technology, that's certainly interesting to us. I can't speak for my colleagues.
I mean, but if you just, I mean, what about like meta markets? So you think about, super complicated solution, but a customer can very easily configure it and get value out of it out of the box, or data sift with their kind of CDSL query builder to be able to mass streams up.
Yeah, I think those are awesome examples of things that solve that production problem. Like, Roger was an anchor investor along with my colleagues in a company called Meta Markets that essentially replaces tens to potentially hundreds of PhDs in very difficult, up to billion dimension real-time analytical problems. And it's very complicated, but it's relatively point and click compared to anything else. DataSift is a company that, again, Roger was an anchor investor in, that does a phenomenal job. We're not investors, by the way. We just admire these guys. Phenomenal job at stitching together actionable semantic information out of huge real-time streams of information, starting with a Twitter feed, which is where they originally made their bones. DataSift has, I think to your earlier point about being embedded in organizations, has Carter become intrinsic to a lot of Wall Street and even a lot of other companies, like pharmaceutical companies worried about consumer sentiment, have literally baked this into certain production streams and workflows. So yeah, those are both awesome examples.
Next. Your name?
Hi, John there. So you guys mentioned that entrepreneurs should focus on very difficult problems. Given that here in New York we have all the customers and the verticals that you guys mentioned, why don't we have more entrepreneurs focusing on these enterprise-focused problems, and why don't we have more enterprise-focused VCs backing them here?
Don't we?
Do you need more than Roger? What's wrong with you?
But I mean, when you compare it to the consumer side of things here.
No, I mean, the bottom line is it's still, New York VC is still relatively small. So you're right. I think this market would support a much greater number and much larger dollar volume of venture investment. I think that's also why we're seeing a lot of West Coast firms spending a lot more time in New York financing these kind of enterprise startups. So it's a fair point. I mean, we're super excited to do it, but obviously, our portfolio is about 50% New York, 50% rest of country / world, with London and Tel Aviv, but kind of San Francisco being the other major center of gravity. Wish we had more. Thanks.
You got to take the next one.
Okay. So I'm Cole. I'm from Weill Medical College, and actually everybody's talking about big data and how to extract data and analyze the data, but not many people are talking about the privacy issue and the ethical issue. For example, like nowadays people are feeling it's very intrusive, all those data technology is so intrusive. So do you actually think about the risk of investing in this business? For example, if the government want to regulate this information extraction, or there is a huge pushback from the public, actually can become a risky factor. So how do you hedge those risks and contain this risk?
I'm going to suggest that the lead investor in Facebook answer this question.
There are no privacy issues. I'm just kidding.
Good answer. Next.
So I think there's today we're talking about technology, and I think that's not always in line with policy. And I think one of the challenges with data right now is that people are collecting data, and people are worried that it's not going to be used for good, right? And I think one of the things that still needs to happen is as people start collecting data, they start seeing the value of what is happening with their data. I think people will be a lot less concerned. But right now, it's kind of going in a black box. You don't know what's going on with it. So I think I always say it's kind of like the technology train is going to keep happening. And at some point, people are going to start putting boundaries on where the trains can go. And I think they're always going to be lagging. Policy always lags. The government always lags the technologists because they can't innovate as fast, right? So I don't think it's going to be an impediment to the adoption of big data technologies. I think it's kind of a non-issue. But I think for certain applications, I think there's going to be more regulation around it. Obviously, the social media sites, but I think if there's certain industries like healthcare and financials where there's just going to be already existing regulations that are going to extend more into some of the big data applications. But I don't know. That wouldn't be a reason why I would not start a company as an entrepreneur. I just don't think it's a durable issue.
So a friend of ours, do you know Zad Nazem?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a friend of ours who is the early CTO at Yahoo, a really brilliant guy, is an investor in, is kind of pushing along a company called Apixio. We're not investors, but we think they're doing really cool stuff that deals with these privacy issues. There's another company that is providing HIPAA-compliant, patient-safe, blinded analytics. They actually have physical servers at each of the major U.S. government-authorized Medicare and Medicaid electronic record centers, and then they have servers that folks like Unum and Aetna and Blue Cross Blue Shield have voluntarily put in their data centers, and you can do a query along the lines of, how many people older than 60 who received less than $40,000 in primary medical care, including, the following antibiotics, died of kidney failure, and actually get an answer. You can't get names, and you can't tie it directly to a ZIP+4 area code. You can get directional information. But those guys are doing interesting stuff. So I actually think privacy is not a threat. It's a business opportunity. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I have. I'm sorry, it's not a.
Sorry, no, we next one. Thanks. No follow up. One or two more.
They're Stealth right now. Stealth Co.
Stealth.
Catchy name.
They're having a little problem trademarking that.
Just a kind of macro question to you, gentlemen. What is the proportional breakdown of investments between the three layers that you described, from infrastructure to core analytics to our vertical applications?
Numerically or dollar-wise? Or
both, actually. I'm
by
very curious.
color?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to give you a vector dot product of the two. Speaking of privacy and blinded information, I would say that probably on the order of 40% for us have been infrastructure, because that's where some of the hardest tech is. Probably 35% in analytics and 25% in the applications layer.
You could have just said a third. That would have been close.
We're big data guys. We want to provide accuracy.
Exactly, yeah.
Just saying.
And then the next one will be in the back if you can. Thank you so much.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. I'm enjoying this panel discussion a lot.
And your name?
Jeroen Janssens. Right. So here in Silicon Alley and also in Silicon Valley, we have a great startup scene, especially for startups that are in big data. In Europe, not so much. I had to come all the way from the Netherlands to work as a data scientist for Visual Revenue, which is being funded by IA Ventures. Nice to meet you, Roger. Thank you.
Good to meet you.
And I was wondering, why is that? What's your view on this? And is there something you can do? Just curious.
Isn't there an organization called Accel Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, we were investors in ClickTech out of the Nordics that seem to do pretty well out of Europe. So I mean I think just historically the venture capital scene in Europe is just a lot smaller than it is in the U.S. So I don't think it's a big data thing. I think it's just I mean we can go, it's a long story of why the European startup market's a little bit less vibrant. There's cultural and there's macro conditions that make it different. But if you have a passion, we have a fund. So we're investing in Europe too. So
I will say that through Seed Camp, we've been seeing a lot more really interesting European companies that have a very strong big data core, and not just in the UK, but in Scandinavia and continental Europe as well. So I am seeing a trend, and I think Seed Camp has actually been really effective in helping to foster entrepreneurship across Europe.
So I can tell you 3 examples of what we've done in Europe, and then tell you why Europe has a problem. So we're seeing, as Ping has previously, and I think still now, at least from the chortling sound from Bruce Golden that I hear all the way over here. I can hear him chortling right now. And Roger mentioned, we see great stuff. In fact, in the past 6 months, we've done 3 companies out of Europe. One real rock star team of open source big data gurus that we did with a kind of a peer fund of Ping's or of Accel, same kind of stature. That doesn't typically invest in Europe, but they were so excited they decided to do it. Another company that we did with Bloomberg Ventures called Parstream, which is a pure German company that does 10 million event per second streaming analytics. And the third company, which we're about to do, which will have to remain nameless, does $100 billion a month of fraud analytics. And just incredibly impressive guys, and out of a part of Europe that even for Europeans, they normally don't think of as a hotbed of innovation. So we're happy with what we've done, but we're resolutely angry at the level of paperwork and government intrusiveness in the EU. I mean, if you want a $500 billion startup scene, you want $500 billion of wealth creation in the next decade in the EU, it's not the people, it's not the universities, it's not the gumption of the entrepreneurs, it's the stifling blanket of regulation. So come up with an LLC or C Corp-like EU common startup company, have zero taxes and zero freaking stamps. If I hear about an apostille for a European startup company one more time, I'm going to punch somebody. So zero stamps, zero certification, just get it done fast. There should not be 6 separate wires, 3 to prove our identity to German banks for the German company that we did before we could even give the startup company money. So you've got to have easier cross-border economic transactions and have a startup visa, have an internal EU startup visa. So those brilliant kids with no jobs from Spain or Portugal or Italy can come to Germany without getting hassled as long-term residents. So this isn't the stuff that the Shenzhen Treaty solved. This is actually people making their lives in one country or another for a startup. Handle those 3 things, and Europe will easily be a rival of the US in the next 20 years in startups and tech. Don't handle them, and it stays a backwater.
Hi.
Great. One last question quickly, and then we'll all go and get drinks.
Hi, in the back.
Your name?
Thank you. Yeah, Charlie Oliver. Thank you so much for this great panel. Larry Linehan, who is over at First Smart Capital, said about 3 months ago on a panel that he would kill to see some innovation in the insurance industry. That entrepreneurs are typically kind of like afraid, maybe not afraid, but it's not a sexy, sector. Can you talk about some of the innovation or, problems that are being solved in the insurance industry and what you'd like to see, what you would invest in?
It's funny. Larry and I talked about that about 100 times. Yeah, it is one of our fantasies to actually work on a deal together in the insurance space. So yeah, I share his pain. I mean, we've looked at several opportunities. I would say, interestingly enough, the auto insurers have been pretty innovative as they've tried to really track everything about a vehicle. So now that actually bleeds into the realm of hardware. And even though we're really not a hardware-oriented fund, we've looked pretty seriously at some of these companies because of the data that these devices are capturing, and then the ability to more accurately price somebody's risk because you actually know how they freaking drive. Not, oh, they got a ticket here and a ticket here, but do they speed? Do they swerve? Do they stop short? I mean, there's all of these. It's a multi-factor equation that goes into how one should best price somebody's risk. So I think that is an area of innovation that is just starting, right now. Another area is kind of playing off of what Matt was talking about with LendUp, which is, using things like social graph and other kind of non-conventional behaviors to score somebody and to more accurately price insurance. So whether, you look at things like LendUp or Wonga or Betfair, similar or Prosper, similar principles can be applied to insurance. It just really hasn't been done at scale yet. But I think it's a super interesting area. But yeah, start something.
Great. Well, thank you so much on behalf of everyone here. We really enjoyed it. Very glad this could happen. And let's all get drinks, preferably over there. The speakers are going to be around for a few more minutes. Thank you very much. The next one is on November 20. Please mark your calendars.